Tugendhat. He was one of the candidates for the leadership of the Conservative Party. Fortunately for him, he didn't get it, and because it seems to be a bit of a poison chalice. But anyway, very nice man. And I said to him, Tom, do you realise there is a house in the Czech Republic called after you? And he smiled and said, I know all about it. I might even be related to the people who lived in that house. Villa Tugendhat. Now, Tom's family hailed from Austria. They were Austrian Jews who fled before the Second World War and the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. So his family were fortunate. They got to Britain, and now Tom, as you know, is a junior minister in the Conservative government. Villa Tugendhat was built in 1929 for Greta and Fritz Tugendhat to a design by the German architect Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the very famous architect. The house was very expensive, but Greta and Fritz Tugendhat were very wealthy people. But the money did not protect them when the Nazis came, because they were Jewish. They were fortunate that they escaped from what was then Czechoslovakia and fled to America. They survived the Holocaust. They lost all their assets. The once beautiful house was used by German soldiers as a stables for their horses, never caring about the history of it, and of course hating it even more because it was designed for a Jewish family. The name Tugendhat means having virtue, one possessed with virtue. It's described, and Susan mentioned UNESCO, it's described by UNESCO World Heritage List in 2001 as architectural purity, an interconnection of interiors, timeless technical equipment, noble and exotic materials, and above all, a high level of preservation. Now, we didn't, and Isabel and myself would have loved to visit the house. It's in Brno, the second biggest city in the Czech Republic, and we haven't time to go there. But we do hope at some stage to visit Villa Tugendhat. But as well as being an architectural gem, as well as being a monument to a Jewish family that had to flee because of the Holocaust, it is an incredibly famous building for the Czech and the Slovak people. The Czech Prime Minister, Vladimir Mesier, and the Slovak Prime Minister, Václav Klaus, met there on August the 26th, 1992, to agree on the separation of the Czech Republic from Slovakia. They had both only just become respective prime ministers of both of those jurisdictions. And on the 1st of January 1993, the two new countries came into being in Europe, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. At that time, Villa Tugendhat was a government building, but because it was halfway between Prague and Bratislava, it was seen as the ideal place to agree to go their separate ways. Now, the main point of contention they had was the question of whether Czechoslovakia was to hold a referendum. And it is possible today, and Czechs would argue to this day, that the decision not to hold a referendum was fortunate. First, in a country consisting of two nations of unequal size, one referendum on a federal level would not work. And then holding two referendums, one in each republic, was also problematic, so no one seemed to know what would happen if one republic voted in favour of separation and the other didn't. The Czechs and the Slovaks, but I don't know the Slovaks, but I know the Czechs, are an incredibly wise people. I'm saying no more than that, but they are incredibly wise people. It should be remembered in 1968, when the Soviet Union and its allies walked into Czechoslovakia with tanks, people took to their streets in masses, but never once used violence. And then later on, reclaimed their country without a shot being fired. Funny enough, the Czech Republic is the least religious country in Europe, and some people blame that on the strict communist system, which absolutely suppressed religion. There are 7 Unitarian congregations in the Czech Republic. I've only visited the one in Prague, and I've preached there on probably about 5 separate occasions. It should be remembered, during the communist days, every Czech minister had to submit their sermon on a Sunday to the Communist Party for approval. That was the nature of the state. Under the Nazis, it was worse. Their minister was taken away and put in a concentration camp where he died. Václav Havel was first president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. He was incredibly loved by the Czech people. He was an author. He was a poet, playwright, dissident, smoker, drinker. You name it, that was Václav Havel. Every bar and restaurant in Prague claims he used to eat or drink there. And I imagine he probably did. He was a friend of Frank Zappa. He was loved by intellectuals in the West, but not always supported. And he often complained that those who cherished freedom in the West never gave him or Charter 77 the support they should have given. He said that the clock stopped in 1947 in Czechoslovakia, once the communist regime took over. The clock stopped. Nothing moved. Not a new thought. No sense of freedom. Now with young people it was a little bit different. Because I remember not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Isabel and myself drove to Berlin to celebrate with the people in Berlin at the collapse of that totalitarian regime. And then we thought, why don't we drive down to Prague? So we drove down to Prague, and we were with a crowd of young people outside the clock tower, the famous clock tower of Prague City. And they were all singing, "We all live in a yellow submarine." How many people here remember the song "Yellow Submarine" by the Beatles? That was their anthem. And it was their anthem because they felt it was the last song they heard before the communists took over. And then they also felt living under such a totalitarian regime was like living in a yellow submarine. And when eventually the system collapsed and thousands of people took to Wenceslas Square, and Havel came out onto the balcony of the wonderful museum and art gallery at the top of Wenceslas Square, the crowd shouted, "Havel nach Rad, Havel nach Rad, Havel to the castle being on the other hill, which is now the home of the president." And Havel, one of the things when he did get to the castle, and he looked at the uniforms of the guards on the castle, and he thought they were the dullest looking uniforms he'd ever seen in his life. So now, and I'm not just saying this, but I think he was influenced by bands such as the East Belfast Protestant Boys Marching Band. Because now the guards wear bright blue and bright pink uniforms. I may be wrong on that, but he could have been. It was difficult for a dissident. It was difficult for a free thinker to assume the role of a political leader. You can imagine the contrast between free thinking, always being the master of your own outworkings, having to merge that with political duties and obligations. His life was filled with contradictions, but aren't all our lives filled with contradictions? And yet his work was consistency, always maintaining the free spirit, as I said in the quotes from earlier on. He wrote the famous essay, "The Power of the Powers." For me, his most profound statement ever, I believe this to be his most profound statement, was regarding what he called utopian dreamers and the many who will die to make their dreams come true. The utopian dreamer will deliver us all to our death. The utopian dreamer will sacrifice 100. He'll sacrifice 1,000. He'll sacrifice millions for his utopian dream. And in that he considered people like Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mao, all utopian dreamers, and some smaller ones we've had here ourselves, who will deliver any amount of people to their death for their utopian dream, which never comes true. Thankfully never comes true, because there is no perfect society, because we are not perfect. And Havel knew that instinctively. He clearly knew the limits of man and not setting the bar too high for humanity. This has become a sort of an in-joke between myself and Isabella lately. They should lower the high jump in the Olympics. A matter of fact, all bars should be lowered, and people shouldn't set bars too high for themselves, and people do that. They challenge themselves with sometimes what's beyond their own ability or expectation. So whatever you do, lower the bar. He believed that. There is a symmetry with that and that other dissident, the man from Galilee, Jesus, who said, not boasting beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labours, but with the hope that as your faith grows, not building ourselves up too much. Don't overdo the CV. Surprise them when you arrive. Matter of fact, downplay it, but then you might get the interview. Let people know you by your work and by your modesty, says he, who has little or no manners. Now, I know that's difficult to consider. And it's always difficult for us to not overstep ourselves. But at times, as Hannah would say, measure carefully what is possibly human for us and for others. Amen.